This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 201 of the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. Many people classify swallowing and feeding intervention as a medical service that shouldn't be addressed in the schools. This is a very black and white and inaccurate way of thinking. Children with complex medical needs have a right to a free and appropriate education, and measuring whether or not students are accessing their curriculum can't be solely based on grades, which is unfortunately what many teams default to when it comes to determining if services and accommodations are educationally relevant. That's why I invited pediatric swallowing and feeding specialist Carolyn Dolby to the De Facto Leaders podcast to talk about what school teams can and should be doing for swallowing and feeding in the schools. Carolyn Dolby specializes in pediatric feeding and swallowing evaluations and interventions as the Dysphagia support speech-language pathologist for a large public school in the Pacific Northwest. In her prior experience as a clinician, she has served populations across the lifespan in medical, in-home, and private practice settings. Her graduate-level courses for the University of Houston prepare the next generation of school-based dysphagia providers. In her bite-sized advice private practice, she provides consultation services and dysphagia support nationwide. She presents locally and nationally with a focus on delivering dynamic dysphagia services. In this conversation, we discuss the phases of swallowing, including the pre-oral phase schools need to consider, how the environment and events leading up to mealtimes impact a kid's ability to eat safely and efficiently in the lunchroom, why the curriculum isn't just about academic areas, and why removing a child from an opportunity to socialize can potentially be a violation of their rights. We talk about why children need to be able to access their least restrictive environment, and they can't do this if they can't maintain adequate nutrition and hydration across the school day. And we also talk about court cases, legal mandates, and which medical services schools should be providing. Be sure to check the show notes for all the great resources mentioned in this conversation, as well as where you can go to connect with Carolyn. Before we get going, I wanted to mention Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs create a system for language therapy. One of the most common complaints I hear from SLPs about language therapy is that they don't know where to start. It can be really challenging to plan therapy and think about how to provide comprehensive services when you feel like you're starting from scratch with every single case. That's why in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, I show you how to find the nice middle ground between making services customized for each individual student's needs, while at the same time utilizing a framework to ensure that your intervention is research-based. To learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Carolyn Dolby. Today, I am joined by Carolyn Dolby, a pediatric speech pathologist. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks, Karen. I'm so excited to be here. So my name's Carolyn Dolby, and I have been a pediatric feeding and swallowing speech pathologist, my gosh, for, for a long time. And my entire career has almost been exclusively in the public schools. We're a different animal in the schools, and
Yes.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
and I'm really excited to kind of talk about what schools what schools can provide, need to provide, and kind of like where we've come and where we need to go, I think is what I'd
Yeah.
like to talk about. But a little bit about me.
Hmm.
I spent most of my career in Texas and Houston, Texas, specifically, working in the school setting there, huge district. Um, I have done a stint in the medical side, of course, in post-acute care. I did some private practice as well as home health. That
Hmm.
really where I really cut my teeth on feeding and swallowing. I think back in the day, we had a lot of training in adult dysphagia. So it
Yeah,
really, in order to do pediatrics, it's a whole nother animal.
it
And
really is.
yeah, and I think
Hmm.
it's so important that speech pathologists that are coming from the adult
Hmm.
realm know that it's, you've got to really um, uh, change your mindset when you're thinking about pediatrics. They don't quite, it's not the same animal. And
Yeah.
so I really spent a lot of my time knowing that this is kind of the focus I wanted to go in. A lot of self-study, a lot of workshops, a lot of conferences, finding mentors,
Hmm.
working along people to really hone my craft. And I love it. I absolutely love it. I think one of the things um, I hear a lot is you do that in the schools?
Yeah. Well, and I know we had some conversations about that because when I was going through my special ed doctoral program, one of my courses was special ed law. And so obviously you talk about school services and what the laws are and what schools are required to provide. And I did a paper on pediatric feeding services in the schools because I had a student at the time who had some, complex medical needs, and I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to be doing. And it got a really interesting reaction from this person who was teaching the course, who was actually a special ed director at the time. So it was just doing an adjunct assignment for the university. So was in the schools as an administrator. And I think that the argument that a lot of SLPs would use is, well, ASHA says we should do it. And his response was, I don't care about ASHA. I don't have to listen to ASHA. I'm concerned
No,
about IDEA and the state board. So it was an
right?
interesting, kind of a wake-up call. And I think it's really important for people to understand that where administrators are coming from. And I know that some people do care, like they want somebody who's has their C's or whatever. And people have different administrators and leaders want different things, but yeah, like I think you really have to make it relevant to what leadership in schools cares about. One thing I wanted to just emphasize before you do that is just that since I do a lot with the language and cognition, and the people are like, oh, this stuff that, like, I came from medical with adults and I did aphasia and adult cognitive, and there's so many parallels with what you're teaching for kids. And there's, like, again, language and cognition through the lifespan. There's a lot of things that you can, not that it's the same with adults versus kids in school age, because you do have to think about school-based issues, but it's different for cognition because there are a lot of parallels, and a lot of people can make that transition a lot easier than if somebody is working with adult dysphagia versus pediatrics. So, and then the schools on top of that. So anyways, I know you were about to kind of talk about, like, I guess what does it look like, and where do you usually start when you start explaining this to people?
Perfect. That's where I start is with terminology because
Okay.
I think that we need to be on the same page when it comes to what are we talking about. And I've recently really I've just changed districts. I've actually moved across the country, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited to be home. And I'm noticing that when people use terms they're using the same terms, but they mean different things. I hear this umbrella term of feeding, And
Hmm.
we really need to distinguish what is feeding versus what is swallowing. And depending on what discipline you are and what setting you are, and even if you're not, or family or whatever, people have different ideas of what feeding and swallowing are. A lot of
Yeah.
times we're not thinking about swallowing. We hear feeding, and
Yeah.
what administrators hear with feeding is that, well, all students are eating at school. So I don't understand what feeding is a big deal. Like all
Yeah.
children are feeding. And what we're really talking, so well, let me go. Feeding is the act, well, what the OTs state in there in I looked it up. What they state is the process of gathering food and getting food from the plate, from the cup, from the spoon, from the fork, from the straw, sip, whatever, from the table to the mouth.
Right. Hmm.
Feeding and self-feeding kind of are interchangeable.
Hmm.
But whereas OTs might use the term eating, that incorporates manipulating the food in the mouth and then getting into the stomach. Whereas speech paths, well, first of all, we're wordsmiths and we absolutely love semantics. Um,
Yes.
and yeah, right. And
Yeah.
we really do understand that there is a definite difference between feeding and swallowing when you look at it through that lens, through, okay, it's self-feeding and then eating. We as speech paths see the connection of feeding and swallowing. So yes, feeding is the act of intaking nutrients and hydration, as well as giving nutrition
Hmm.
and hydration. We see it as that dyad
Oh,
um,
yeah.
of
Hmm.
giving and taking. So we can feed ourselves, we're feeding others. Totally two different animals too. And along with that, when we look at what feeding is, it isn't if I think it was K2 May might have said it because in one of her things where she
Hmm.
says, if eating was easy, everyone would be doing it. And
Hmm.
then if somebody's not doing it, it's not that easy. It isn't that you just sit down and eat, you
Hmm.
know, and and as speech paths too, we love to break everything down to its sum of its parts. So we really understand where the breakdown is because that's what we want to remediate, right?
Hmm.
So when we're looking at feeding, we have to look at all the steps of feeding, even for ourselves. We have to have that cycle of feeling hunger and thirst. Well, some of us will eat or drink for that matter when we're not hungry, but that's an
Yeah.
emotional thing or whatever. That's
Yeah.
a story for another time.
Hmm.
First, we have to have that interoception where we understand what's happening inside our bodies, that we are hungry and what those hunger cues mean. And then we have to have food available. And then we are checking food for suitability all the time.
Hmm.
We're looking at it. First, we might even be listening to somebody cooking. We're listening to cooking sounds and the smell of that. And we're like, ooh, okay, that's, whetting our appetite literally.
Hmm.
We'll look at the food, we'll smell the food, we're watching people interact with the food, especially if you go to a restaurant with maybe an international cuisine that you've never been
Hmm.
before, but you're going, you know what, I'm adventurous, I'm gonna go try this out. And you see some plate come out and you're like, I don't know what that is.
Hmm.
And you try this, go somewhere that you would not normally eat and watch yourself and feel yourself go through all these steps you take for granted. You're going
Hmm.
to watch somebody how they're going to eat it, because if a plate comes and it looks like it's still moving, you're going to want to know, how is somebody going to eat that? And am I even going to want to eat it?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
all part of feeding. And we haven't even got to the mouth yet.
Yeah.
Um, right? And so then
Yeah.
we all this interplay too. I mean, if you think about what's happening around you, if there is a huge commotion going on, a loud noise, fighting, um, just a lot of sensory, are you really going to be wanting to eat? You're going to be like trying to, I mean, there's so much
Yeah.
going on. How can you then
Or
be like,
smells,
oh, right, smells, or oh, right.
or when you're like sitting down and you're not at a table and you don't have all of your stuff and you've got to,
Yeah, right,
figure it out.
right. Like you're out and you're trying to get it on your lap and you don't even have a fork. So you're like, okay, how am I gonna use this the end of my, my knife, and
This
I'm gonna try
fork,
to, Yeah,
The most pointless utensil ever.
yeah. Right, right. So you're like, okay, I think I'm gonna like sip it out of the container, spoon it in with
Yeah.
my finger. Right. I mean, there's so many things that we all, but we're also cognitive. We have a lot of, we're ambulatory. We don't have a lot of physical. I mean, we've got physical, don't have these other things that we're competing with.
Yeah.
So we can figure out how to, maneuver that, or we might just say, okay, I'm going to wait for a minute and, ask for a fork or whatever. But again, right. Or we're putting a little kid who, like our littles that are 3, to sit at a cafeteria table, which is a stool, which is this far away from the table. And we sit there and they're teetering on it. And we're wondering why they're standing up, or putting their hand, and the teacher's like, sit down, sit down. I mean, so like eating hasn't even happened. And this child is now stressed out.
Yeah.
And we also know that a lot of us, we don't eat when we're stressed. I don't know whoever claimed that said this, but I'll never forget this either. But when your stomach is full of butterflies, it's too full for food.
Yeah.
And
Oh yeah. I mean, that totally, I have to, if I'm nervous about something,
yeah.
when you're like, I need to eat because I need calories and I'm going to feel awful later, but you have to kind of force it down
Right.
sometimes.
And
Or
we're adults and we have the cognitive thought that says, okay, I do need to take a bite now because I won't have the energy to continue what I'm about to have to do. So I am
yeah.
going to force myself to eat something, or more specifically, drink something.
Yeah.
So all this I call this the pre-oral phase of swallowing.
See, I didn't even think of it that way because now, the restaurant example that you gave, I mean, because I think I'm a pretty adventurous eater, but
Mhm.
if I'm in a place and I don't know what's going on, or like I'm in a hurry and I'm, where you're like, I only have 30 minutes for lunch and there's a long line and I got to get back to work and how long is this going to take me to eat and all this, I go to my comfortable things. So
Right,
I go to my things that I know because I don't want to have to make a decision. It's not that I don't think I would like the other food, but it's like it's a risk
right,
or it's another decision and it's cognitive load and it's overwhelming. And sometimes
exactly.
it's like at the end of the day when you're talking to your significant other and it's, what do you want for dinner? I don't know. What do you want for dinner? And you're like, just somebody make a decision, you
Yeah,
know?
it's a lot of work, and sometimes
Yeah.
a lot of a lot of times when there is just so much
Hmm.
going on, so much change, you want some familiarity, and thinking like, I know what I like my thing when I was down in Texas, there was a place called Taco Cabana. They don't have them up here, and I'm so sad. But I do know that the black bean taco never does me wrong. And I know
Hmm.
that if I can get a black bean taco every single time, it's going to be great.
Yeah.
Um, I can't always trust the soda pop that comes out of the fountain from,
Interesting.
right? Because
Huh.
the taste is different. So I don't always get that, because I'm never sure what the taste is going to be. But I do know that black bean taco. So that brings me to the point of, they call picky feeders, or why do children
Yeah.
want
Yeah.
to have the
That's
same food,
mhm.
is because they know that it's not going to do them dirty.
Yeah.
They're, they
Oh
know
man,
that
I
they're,
can
yeah.
think of so
Have
many
you
situations. Yeah.
So I'll never forget, when my daughter was younger, we're sitting at the table. It was just her and I.
Hmm.
And I used to like to do fancy dinners, her and I, just 2 girls, and
Yeah.
we're setting it up at the fancy table, her food, and we're sitting next to each other, and I pour
Hmm.
her milk, and I might have poured myself an adult beverage. And we're eating and we're chatting, and I go to
Hmm.
take a drink of my Sauvignon Blanc, and I take a big mouthful of milk. And I'm like, okay, first of all, I like milk. I drink
Hmm.
milk in my coffee. I eat it in my
Hmm.
cereal. I will drink chocolate milk. But because I was expecting something else, and
Yeah.
it did not taste anything, I was disgusted. I like heaved. And think about that when a child is thinking like they're going to eat something. Oh, you're gonna like it. It's just like chicken.
Yeah.
How many times have people, oh, it tastes just like chicken? You
Hmm.
know what? No, no, it doesn't taste just like chicken. And you're expecting chicken. So, I mean, it's all this pre-party, before we're getting it into our belly.
And the
Okay.
variations of
Oh,
chicken,
yeah.
like, is it breaded? Is it just, I remember I had a autistic student who he really liked Oreos, but you couldn't take a big Oreo and break it into pieces. It had to be
Oh,
the
no.
little ones,
Yep.
because again, it was different. And I don't,
Yeah.
it's weird how
Visual.
little things, textures impact the taste, or even, how people are like, the blue M&Ms taste best.
Oh,
Well, that kind of thing. Just
no.
other tactile sensory things
Yeah.
impacts the experience.
That is so funny you said that, and it just reminded me. My family teases me because we love Good and Plenty's. It's not a candy for everybody, but in my
Oh, I
family, we
love
love
Good and
it.
Plenty's.
Hey,
Black licorice, it's not for
okay,
everyone.
no, but I love it. But I
Same.
refused to eat the pink ones. I would only eat the white ones. I can't
Huh.
tell you why now it was, but it did taste differently to me. And I can't I eat them both now, but back in the day, no, I would absolutely not. And but to this day, I don't eat grape Skittles. I don't like them.
Oh,
So
the artificial grape
yeah,
flavor. Yeah.
yeah, I
You
don't
know
eat the
what? You
grape.
know what it is? They do that grape fluoride, the trays at the dentist.
Yes.
My dad was my dentist. So
Okay.
take us in on Saturday and like do all of us, like bring the whole family in and just, get all our teeth done. And that thing that you have to do, the fluoride
Mhm.
treatment when you're a kid, and he
Yep.
had grape flavor. And I remember there were a couple times that we went that, somebody had a cold and we'd be over at grandma's eating spaghetti, and then he'd be sticking stuff in our mouths, and like somebody projectile vomited like every time we went. It was like,
Oh
whose turn
my
was it this
gosh.
time? So with that grape flavor,
Do you
I
have a
mean, I wouldn't
visceral?
say that I have a taste aversion. Like I could eat grape Skittles, but I just don't really like the like the anything that is like grape juice is okay for me. I could eat grape Skittles, but whenever they ask me what kind of toothpaste I want at the dentist, I'm like, just stick with mint. Just
Yeah,
don't
not
stick
yeah,
anything in my
yeah.
mouth that's not
I'm gonna
flavored.
have to think that I'm gonna have to ask my mom about that because I'm wondering if I had an adverse reaction
Yeah,
rate because I
yeah.
will I really I mean I do pick them out. I'm picky on that. But anyway,
Mhm.
so
Yeah,
that's all feeding. Um,
yeah. We
that's
haven't
all
even
about
gotten to the
feeding.
point where we've
No,
consumed anything yet.
not at all. We could spend the entire time just on getting ourselves to allow something into our mouths. And
Hmm.
so when we think about swallowing, everyone thinks of the pharyngeal phase. That's
Hmm.
it.
Yeah.
But we have to really look what is swallowing. It
Hmm.
is the three stages, the four phases, right? The
Hmm.
oral stage, the pharyngeal stage, and the esophageal stage. In the oral stage, we have the oral preparatory stage and the oral transit. But
Hmm.
what I have just been explaining is or the pre-oral phase,
Hmm.
right? And they call it the anticipatory phase.
Hmm.
And all of that has to be happening before we can even get oral prep because we have to want to put something in our mouths. Like
Yeah.
it's a volitional activity. We want to put something in our mouths or we don't.
Yeah.
And so there think about the kid that's not
Or
wanting to
just
eat.
what happens at school and how much
Yeah,
time you get in the lunchroom and everything
right.
else that's going on, and
And
or leading up to that in the morning.
yeah, I mean, they've had all these task demands. They've been maybe somebody's had a meltdown. They didn't get their where they wanted to sit. They've been, as my daughter said when she was little, they were telling me what to do all the day. Telling me, just what happened up to that. And then they're expected to navigate this cacophony of an ant farm, to get it, where they're just, what do you want? What do you want? No, you've got to have two vegetables, two fruits. You got to have this. You got to have that. And the kid is just like, oh my gosh, and yeah. So there's so much, and then to wonder, and they're sitting teetering on the chair, and I mean, there's just so much stuff. And then they're supposed
Yeah.
to eat, and then they're being, unfortunately, I hear a lot of yelling from staff members also, it's too loud in here.
Well,
And
and the noise level, and then everybody is trying to
yeah,
go over each other, and
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sure that we are as I say with the language and cognitive, we're working with comorbidities here. So
Yes,
whatever is impacting the feeding, the swallowing is going to impact the ability to
right.
navigate that whole situation.
And then think about it, they turn the lights off to keep them quiet. And now a child with
Seeing
low
food.
vision, a
Yeah.
child with low vision can't even see where the food is,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so that's all the feeding. But then when we're looking at swallowing, and this is what I think is the missing piece for our clinicians in the school setting, is they say feeding. And
Hmm.
that's not the full picture.
Hmm.
You have to say swallowing. I love Emily Homer. She's my spirit animal. And I often say feeding and swallowing because it rolls off my tongue better. But she
Hmm.
is so good at always saying swallowing and feeding. Put what is most
Mm.
important first. And that
Okay.
really is swallowing and feeding, swallowing safety.
Hmm.
Feeding is fun, swallowing needs to be safe. Okay.
Yeah.
I think I
Yeah.
just made that up. I'm going to coin that. That's cool.
Okay. Yeah, we'll go with it.
Eating is fun and swallowing safe. And so we've got the oral phases, right? We have the oral prep where we have to be able, so I break that down into bolus acceptance.
Hmm.
Okay, you're checking it for suitability as it's coming to your face, as hopefully you're bringing it to your own face. You're checking it for suitability. Then bolus procurement, where you're able to clear it from a spoon, take it from a fork, finger feed yourself, sip, suck, however you can get. So you
Hmm.
procure the bolus into your mouth. Then bolus containment, you've got to be able to keep it without the anterior loss, losing it
Hmm.
immediately from either a tongue thrust or uh, lip decreased lip closure, or contain it in your mouth that you don't have it rushing to the back of your throat and entering your pharyngeal vestibule before you've even organized for a swallow. So
Hmm.
that's bolus containment. Then we've got bolus formation. Well, bolus containment for liquids, that's easy. You sip
Hmm.
it, hold it, swallow it, right? Well, it's not that easy, but let's just for easy math, let's say that.
Right. Hmm.
And then for solids, let's say we put it at midline. So bolus procurement, we put it at midline. Containment, we closed our lips. Um, Formation, we've got to lateralize it to our molars using our cheeks, our tongue, our dental arches, our teeth, everything to keep it, grind it using hopefully a beautifully executed rotary chew. As it breaks it
Yeah.
down, it's mixing with our saliva, it's moving over to the falling back onto our mid blade, moving it to the other side, picking up all those pieces, mixing it, the bolus with the saliva. Now we've got bolus formation. Now it's back into that ball. Now that's a very cheap and fast version of what is bolus, what is oral prep. And
Hmm.
then we have to have oral transit, that AP transit where we've gathered the pieces, then we've got our tongue tip rises, then we've got to have that suction of our tongue to our palate to propel it back in a kind of a motion like this. We got to make sure we don't have food that's falling into our lateral sulci or our anterior sulci, and propel it back for then the swallow reflex. That's all oral phase. So that's a lot. And
Yeah.
that's the one we see a lot in the schools. And I talk a lot with my staff about the oral phase because that's what we can see it. We can
Yeah.
document what we see. But then, okay, so I'm going to come back to that phase. But then we go to the pharyngeal phase, which starts as like we can force ourselves to swallow, but a lot of us were not thinking, so we call it a swallow reflex because
Hmm.
at the point that it gets into our pharynx, we're no longer really volitionally moving it through. I mean, our little brain is moving it through,
Yeah.
and for the sake of time, we're just going to go. Yes, we know we're going to propel it through into our esophagus, right? But that pharyngeal phase, a lot goes down. What's all happening at pharyngeal, and this is where when you start thinking about it and I start talking about it, everyone's like, oh my God. But I just say it's for easy math. Just think of valving. We have to valve. We have to valve things off, close, and valve things open. The first thing, if you think about it, we've got to valve off our airways. We have
Mm-hmm.
to valve off our nasal passageway where our soft palate rises and articulates and closes off our nasal passage at the same time our tongue deploys, depresses, and our larynx rises, our epiglottis covers over our trachea. This is just quick math, guys. Closing off and directing the bolus into the esophagus, right? So we're valving off our nasal passage. We're valving off our trachea, our airway. So there's no breathing anymore.
Mm-hmm.
While we're valving those closed, we're valving open our upper esophageal sphincter, our cricopharyngeal sphincter, to open just in time, just long enough and large enough for that bolus to go through and close.
Mm-hmm.
And then, speech paths are like, well, esophageal, that's not us. Well, think about it. And I'm sorry, I am a junior high boy and I'm disgusting and I love it. Because I talk about it, I go, we've all burped. I'm sorry, we all have. Ladies, don't act like you
Yeah.
haven't.
Yeah.
And a little bit of food has come back up into our throat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Happens.
Yeah.
Now it's back in our playgrounds as speech pathologists. If we're burping up food and we lay the child down, gravity is my friend and foe. I trust gravity to do its job every single time. It doesn't mess with us. It's not, haha, today. No, gravity will always, if you step off, you step off the roof of your house, you will plummet to the floor, plummet
Mm-hmm.
to the ground every
Yeah.
single time. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry, unless you're in a dream, you're going to plummet. So, and then gravity takes the course of least restriction, right? So esophageal, even though yes, we don't assess it, but we do, and we don't treat it because it's usually treated medically, but we do monitor for it and
Yeah.
refer out. Anyway, okay, so
Right.
enough of that. We're back at, so at pharyngeal is where we have the choking, we have the aspiration, all these things that are freaking people out. But I think I'm just kind of going off on a tangent here for a minute. But when we are talking to our administrators, and
Mm-hmm.
we actually, I do a training every year, and I just do a general what is feeding and swallowing, and I really talk a lot about the phases and stages of swallowing
Mm-hmm.
because it really gets them thinking, oh my gosh, because we're talking about the children. Oh, coming back to maybe this was your question. Why are we doing this in schools?
Well,
Yeah,
I think it
that
was where
question.
do we start? But I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs create a system for language therapy by focusing on the essential components of vocabulary that help students develop a foundation to support strategic planning, to support high-level processing, and to give them those vocabulary and syntactic skills they need that are going to support literacy and life outcomes. As a clinician, especially if you are in the schools, it can be really difficult to know where to start. In fact, that's probably the biggest pain point that I hear from school SLPs is where the heck do I start? What is my hierarchy? How can I prioritize all these possible skills when my students have so many different needs and I have so many different people telling me all these different messages about where I should be focusing? What I do in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is give you a 5-component framework that supports those language skills that are going to build the foundation that students need to support their academic skills, their vocational skills, their reading and writing skills, all those things that are going to help them be successful in school and in life beyond school. That 5-component framework focuses on vocabulary as the core umbrella area where we are supporting students. And the elements that fit under that umbrella are orthography, morphology, phonology, semantics, and syntax. So we're building a foundation for students to have that high level processing, to be able to understand sentences at the word level, at the sentence level, and to be able to formulate complex thoughts for high level strategic planning. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. What we started with was we have to talk about this in a way that administrators can understand so they see it's
Yes,
relevant. And
yes.
I think what what we've seen in this, like with how long it takes to even explain what
Yeah.
swallowing and feeding are,
Mm-hmm.
you can see why it would be relevant to do something in the schools. Now, I know that you'll probably elaborate. What's the difference between what you would do in a medical setting versus what you would do in a school? And I think it's you have to know all of the phases to know where you would enter, one, how it's relevant, how to talk to administrators about it in a way that they see that it is relevant to the school, and then to know which parts you could address in the school in
Perfect.
order to be in compliance.
Mm-hmm.
And then have to make that distinction between where do we draw the line between medical and school? And I think that's really where people
Okay.
struggle. And because
Perfect.
because people kind of go, that's where you get people who are too black and white with it, where it's like, oh, it's medical, it's not my job.
I'm
And
so glad you asked that
you
because
know,
I've got a really good answer.
yeah,
And
like maybe we can just start
it's
with
in the
like
law.
medical versus like the law, and then medical
Uh-huh.
versus school. And
Yeah.
how do we talk to administrators about this?
Well, um, okay, you've got to start with the law.
Yeah,
And there's two Supreme Court cases, and I want to say 84 and 99, I think. Is like so is when it that's how far back. Like
yeah.
this is just something new, people. This
Hmm.
was back in 84. And 89. I think it's Tatro and Garrett cases. These were two cases that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it changed, and I can't believe we're still fighting about it. Like I'm still shocked. Because
Yeah.
both of the cases involved physically disabled um, students with multiple disabilities. I can't believe I
Hmm.
just that required health-related services. One included catheterization, and the
Hmm.
other included the need for a one-on-one nurse with seizures and trach care and G-tube care and all of that. Okay, and one was the
Hmm.
catheterization. Now, at the time, the schools were saying that no, that's medical. We don't need to do that.
Hmm.
Um, that needs to be done medically. Okay, Supreme Court concluded in both those cases that the only things that are excluded from the school setting are those medical medical things that may only be done by a medical doctor.
Hmm.
Okay, dialysis. Okay, we're not going to be doing dialysis school or a open heart surgery,
Hmm.
right?
Or what
But
about like with voice? Like if you have vocal nodules, you would go to an ENT to have like, or if you had polyps or something,
yeah,
like
right.
you'd go
We're
to an
not
ENT to
going.
have that
Yes.
removed, but you could still do therapy in the schools.
Hmm. But if parents can put in a catheter, you don't need a medical license. Oh, that's what I should have said. Things that medical procedures that need to be only done by a medical profession that has licensing for that procedure. Any things that can be delegated to the family can be done in the schools.
Okay.
Families do catheterizations, families do tube feeds, families do trach care, and families do seizure interventions, VNS. We don't put in, but we
Hmm.
definitely monitor that and follow seizure action plans. So these two cases set the stage about what is medical and what is school. The only thing that is medical are procedures that can only be done by a licensed professional and not somebody in the school setting. And then there's a ton of litigation out there, a ton of court cases that really found districts culpable and liable for the denial of FAPE. But before I go there, let me jump back because I just jumped ahead about you said, and it is so true, schools only do what they have to do. And that sounds ugly, but it's not. schools should only do what they
Hmm.
have to do.
Yeah.
We aren't here to just do everything and anything because a parent wants it. I know that makes me sound ugly, but I'm not. But
Well, they
we
can't do what they're supposed to do if they try to do everything.
That's a better way of putting it. We
Yeah.
can't do what we're supposed to do if we're trying to do everything. So when
Hmm.
we think about what do we have to do? Well, we're all in special ed. We're speech pathologists.
Hmm.
Our situation is special ed, which is not a placement, it is a service. Okay.
Hmm.
It's not a placement and it's a
Right.
service. So we're serving special ed. And our governing law is under IDEA, right? The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And IDEA established the provision of FAPE, which is free and appropriate public education. Free, the A in FAPE is appropriate. And I always point this out
Yeah.
because we all want the
Uh-huh.
A to be awesome. And it's not. It's not awesome. It is
Hmm.
appropriate. And we all are awesome. And I
Yeah.
remember growing up, it's okay to feel special. It's not okay to act special. And
Well,
so,
and that's what that administrator that I was talking about earlier, he really emphasized the appropriate in
so
that
let's
that
talk about
special
that.
ed law class.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the
Yeah.
appropriate of IDEA and
And
FAPE
reasonable.
and
That's another
reasonable
one
when it
that comes
comes
up.
to dysphagia.
Hmm.
Okay, IDEA does not specifically say the term dysphagia in its wording, but it does follow up by saying that it does talk ad nauseum about related services that are needed. Well, they say it in a way of if certain medical or not medical, health related or medical, if you want, services are not provided, the adverse effect would be denying the child FAPE. For example, if we do not provide asthma treatments at school, and the student has an asthma attack, first of all, it could be deadly. Second
Yeah.
of all, the student, what are they going to do? They're going to call, and the student's going to go home.
So they have to leave. It's like
They
they
have to leave
can't be at school all day because they can't go that long without their medical treatment.
without the nebulizer,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, if a student if a student is if a student is given a plate of a hoagie sandwich and
Hmm.
a milk, and they're first of all, they aren't physically capable of opening any of the packages. They have questionable dentition. They maybe they're incoordinated, and they fatigue. They're all, I mean, there's so many, a
Yeah. Hmm.
million reasons of
They
why
they wouldn't even, I think the
attempt.
time constraint, like
Yeah.
you could easily say, this student needs, well, and I would love to hear what the services look like once we
Yeah,
finish
yeah, yeah.
talking about this, but you could see that the student would not be able to, in the time allotted, in the typical lunch period or the snack time or the time that they get to get a drink or whatever it is, to be able to do what they need to do
Right,
in order to get
right.
adequate nutrition during the school day and stay hydrated.
Right. So, for example, if you were going on a really long road trip and you didn't want to stop for lunch and you were going to pack something, would you pack something that needed to be microwaved? Like, would you
Yeah.
bring like a bag of raw carrots that needed to be, I mean, just think about the ridiculousness of
Yeah.
like what you would bring, versus maybe you bring a bag of, trail mix versus you're going to like put something together while you're driving. So, I mean, it just some of this seems like a no-brainer, but you kind of, for me, what works for me is I bring things to the pendulum has to swing to ridiculousness for me to come back to say, see why we're asking this? Because you're
Yeah.
asking a child to do something that they can't do. So the law does state that we are mandated to provide these health procedures, these health if we don't address safety and health, if we don't give children the medicine that they need midday,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
If we, or the medical need that they need, or feed them, they're forced to be in school. I mean, this isn't a choice. I mean, parents can make the choice of
Right,
homeschooling or private. Yeah, I
right.
mean, but at age 6, all children need to be at school. I mean, it's not only a safety for the child, it's for the world. We want all of our citizens to be these wonderful people that have the
Yep.
knowledge. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so we have to feed them because they're forced to be there, and so we do have to feed the children. Another regulation is our federal meal programs.
Mm-hmm.
Our If your schools are participating in the federal meals program where they get breakfast and lunch and they get reimbursed for that meal and all of that, the USDA, I guess that is law, and some other federal regulations state that children that are unable to consume the meal as presented must have they must have the modifications deemed necessary under medical directives. I might have just messed up the wordage on that, but basically it says if we have a medical reason that they can't eat the meal as it is given, for example, this is an easy one, a child that has a life-threatening food allergy.
Mm-hmm.
You are not going to say, I'm sorry, shrimp poppers are on the meal menu, and I don't care that your throat's going to close. You have to eat it because that's what everybody else is eating.
Mm-hmm.
No, we have to ensure that we don't kill a child. So we have
Yeah.
to have other foods for food, this is not for just that kid that's like, I think today I am going to try keto, or today I think I'm a vegetarian. Now, I respect family and faith-based practices. That's a story. I'd love to talk about that because we do need to honor that. But
Yeah.
I'm talking about what we have to do. We
Mm-hmm.
have to
Legally.
ensure that,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that if a child has a life-threatening allergy, that we have alternatives for them. Again, now what people kind of get sad about, and I really am like a delightful person and love, and I want everyone to be like, I want everybody to have everything, but I also am realistic in that we can't make everybody happy. So we have
Mm-hmm.
to have an alternative, but it might not be something that they like. That's different.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? We have to have something that is safe. So we have to have an alternative, right, for those students that have milk allergies that can have milk. So we have a liquid alternative. Um, the same for students that are unable to eat the texture due to a disability. We have to provide, not we, the cafeterias are bound by this regulation. And I think what that is huge that schools aren't realizing that it is the cafeteria's job to provide food also in the texture that is needed for students with a medical directive. That
Mm-hmm.
can be a doctor's note. And when I'm talking to schools and I'm getting, so I work with schools and develop their programs, their dysphagia feeding and swallowing support programs all over the country, which I love doing. The first thing I say is get doctor's notes. Once you have that established in your protocol, in your procedures, then once you have that, then I'm going to tell you another thing. If it is written in the IEP, that is a directive.
Yeah.
That is a bound directive. So I do say sometimes just for easy math for your administrators, get it in writing with the physician. Then once everyone's like, okay, you're right. Look at how our children are at school. Our children that would be out of school because malnutrition, undernutrition, dehydration, whatever myriad of issues that happen when they are not provided food and liquid that is appropriate. Well, I'm not saying awesome.
Yeah.
Appropriate
And
for
I think
them.
what you were saying before about it doesn't have to be, you don't have to give them this complete array of options, but you have to
No.
give them an alternative that they can eat. So
Yes.
they're going back to the reasonable and appropriate.
Yes,
So that's where that boundary is.
it is. And this is what I also say. We're not Burger King. You can't have it your way. Meaning, like, a parent can't come and say, okay, I want to because we get our food. We aren't going to a grocery store and we're not an individual, we're not a restaurant, if
Hmm.
so to speak, that we can't have, there's not everything can be off menu.
Right.
Everything has to be on menu, meaning we have to have the regular menu, right? That's great. But then we also have to have alternative menus, but everything has to be on menu. So we have to have a plan in place for our students that need puree, that are students that need minced and moist, the students that need soft and bite size. And if you're listening out there and going, what are those words you're talking about? I implore you to go look up IDDSI, IDDSI. It's the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative. That is another thing that will change your world. IDDSI, IDDSI.org. And I use those terms when I'm talking about food modifications.
Mm-hmm.
I do a whole workshop on it. So much fun on how to modify foods, because a school might say, well, we don't know how to modify. I'd be like, listen, sweetie, I'm going to show you right quick, and it is going to be easy. All you need is a fork and a spoon, right? And I can show you how to do it. Oh, and also with thickened liquids, using the IDDSI framework, instead of like nectar thick and honey thick, which open to interpretation.
Oh yeah, it's such a range.
Their testing methods for liquid is so easy. 2 syringes. In fact, they have 1 syringe now that they make. It's so great. And it's how fast it flows through in 10 seconds. And now we've got we have mildly thick and moderately thick. It just makes more sense. And
so they have a different way of defining it, because I remember it was honey and nectar, and when I was in the skilled nursing, I never really knew if I was getting it right.
Yeah, so it was like, so they have thin, slightly thick, mildly thick, and moderately thick, and extremely thick, which makes more sense than nectar or half nectar. That doesn't make any sense, and we were eyeballing it. No, they're objective testing measures, easy to understand wordage. It's wonderful, and it makes it easy for the cafeterias and the staff. I understand that not all schools' cafeterias are equipped to, or all districts are equipped to have a full dysphagia menu like my district in Texas. My new district here isn't. So I am working within those confines, and I understand. In a perfect world, we would have the food come already prepared like I did in Texas. And in Texas, not all the districts could do that. It was just the district I was at. But if everybody is following the same procedures, that because puree can look different to different people, and if you're using IDDSI, it will change your world. I want to stop.
What about like when you're thinking about what intervention looks like in the school? Because we're talking a lot about, I think all the things that you're saying, we haven't even talked about, or you haven't mentioned, here's a speech pathologist who's doing a session with the student. It's all like what we've covered so far is all about modification and accommodation. So what does it look like in the schools? Because there's those 2 categories of accommodations and then actually therapeutic services. So how does that look in the schools?
Well, I'm going to back up for just a minute to talk about let me give you how I define what services are in the schools.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And I use the term dysphagia, but I historically, so I'm trying to start saying swallowing and feeding instead of dysphagia, because then people know, consistent terminology. So what do swallowing and feeding services look like? I say it is utilizing specialized clinicians, providing student-centered feeding and swallowing interventions supported by well-trained staff following standardized procedures. Okay. So what do we have to do? Okay, first of all, we're not feeding clinics. That is really important to make the distinction. We're not a feeding clinic. Feeding clinics are services that are provided in either a clinic or the home with family. It's a family-centered service delivery. And in the schools, it isn't family. It's a community services, right? I mean, individualized, but
community. You could call it community-based.
Community-based. Right? So, like, and why are we at school? to learn the curriculum, right? To socialize, to learn about the world and to learn about our peers. It's not just academics. I mean,
Right.
we're here. It's not just so it, but it does. You have to have access to your education.
Mm-hmm.
That's our services. So just because a parent wants you to eat broccoli should not be a reason that we have a goal.
Right.
This is where like people say you say completely opposite things at the same time, and I kind of do. Because I will say this, our job is not to teach a child to eat a school lunch. Okay, eating school lunch is not part of the curriculum. So if they don't like what's being served, it's not our job to teach them to eat the school lunch. Okay, they have the right to a school lunch. And if we need to make those modifications in order for them to access their school lunch, that's what we need to do.
Mm-hmm.
Now then it sounds like, oh no, now we don't expand a diet. That's not true. Okay. What children, yeah, I've been doing a lot about keeping kids safe. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
kids need to be safe. So it's one. Kids need to be efficient because like what you've mentioned before, the time constraint.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's another reason why we might be doing modifications to the meal
Mm-hmm.
because of efficiency.
Yep.
But children also have the right to be socializing and eating with their peers,
Mm-hmm.
and ingesting adequate. So they need to be safe, efficient, and adequate. They need to have adequate uh, nutrition and hydration, but they also need to be able to socialize with their peers.
That's a
So,
big one that I don't think people think
yep.
about, because if you're like, oh, well, your accommodation is you get to go eat by yourself in the classroom,
Mm.
then that
You,
doesn't, then you don't get to socialize.
the denial of FAPE is in part of a free and appropriate public education is in the least restrictive environment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you think about environment, everybody thinks of a placement, which we do. We don't want them isolated in the basement of the school.
Right.
We don't want them isolated in the classroom where they're working in the classroom and they have all these task demands. They want to get out of there. Everybody wants to get out of there. I want to go somewhere else. So not only that environment, but the least restrictive environment. So if you are having a child eat puree because it's faster, it's more efficient and quicker, that's a really restrictive environment when that child could actually and that's not what their peers are eating.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking at environment this way too. And yes, we are charged if a student is appropriate. Not all students are appropriate to move through the continuum. Some students must have puree, and that is it. But well, in my way of thinking, if you can do puree, you most likely can minced and moist. That's a quick,
Yeah.
fast. And once we get that, then we can start moving on. Like we can move them, and the services, yes. And this is where it gets a little tricky and sticky. Is I'm not saying that speech pathologists have to have a goal that says the student will eat 10 bites of a non-preferred food. First of all, that's a clinic. That is at home. First of all, we're not food handlers, right? We're not. Where's this food coming from? Where's this food going to be kept?
Mm-hmm.
Where's this food going to be heated up and prepared? I mean, do you see how this like that is not an expectation that should be in the school setting. We don't have kitchens. We don't have, so we can't look at it like, yes, we're going to bring feeding clinics into the school. No, we're going to look at what we're doing in the schools, what we need to do in the schools, and what can we do, and not what can we do, what should we be doing? There's a lot of things that we can be doing to move our children from the continuum through
So
the
you're
continuum.
really what we're saying. It's like, we're not saying that. So here's what a student who doesn't have a medical condition would get access to. They would have the option of having an alternative meal, because that's already in the law for students that maybe wouldn't necessarily need swallowing and feeding services. That's already there. So that's technically part of the curriculum because it's something that's available. So, like you said, going back to having the right. So, I mean, in theory, would you be doing therapy to try to get students to try different, or at least like providing opportunities to try some of those different textures, and
Okay.
then so that they could have experience the array of things that are offered in the schools, so they could potentially have access and have the opportunity to be eating some of the things that their peers are eating. Not saying we're going to go, bring in a 3-star Michelin restaurant
Right.
and like offer them the array of everything. We're going to get them to be able to experience the things that their peers are experiencing. So that's the
Yeah.
distinction of
And this is how I get the
really
admin
get the
on board.
appropriate. Yeah.
Because I think admin starts freaking out that we're going to be bringing in all this food and doing,
Yeah.
this feeding treatment. Okay, no, but let's talk about curriculum and access to the curriculum. Easy, easy peasy. I was a kindergarten teacher before I was at SLP, and we talked about apples. Apples was our theme in the fall, and I brought in a bunch of
This
apples.
is interesting.
We
Yeah.
we looked at apples. We counted apples, we sorted apples, we charted apples, apples of different colors. We cut them open, we looked at them, we touched them, we tasted them, we ate them, we cooked with them, we made things out of them. And what about that student that is on puree? Or a student, not even that, a student that is freaking not, is having a hard time they're dysregulated because apple's not safe to them. And now they're over their dysregulation because they know their body can't handle an apple. Now they're being walked around the campus or, removed from the situation. Now they're missing out on their curriculum, which is apples. Yes, we need to be putting some supports in place for them to be able to interact with their curriculum. It's the same as if a student, if you asked me to sit down and do some, calculus, I probably would freak out. But if I was in school, you can't just say, "Oh, Carolyn doesn't like math, so she doesn't have to do math."
Yeah.
No, we've got to find a way for Carolyn to do the math.
Yeah.
And put some supports in place for.
You know what I'm thinking too? How much do you talk about, how does the apple taste it for a vocabulary building activity?
Sure.
How would you even be able to talk about that if you had no experience with it and background knowledge of what the texture means?
Yes, we take things for granted when we, as neurotypical and physically able people, we take so much for granted that, well, this is just the way it was when I was in school or something. Well, no, that's damaging. And we've got to have those supports for all our students in order to interact with their curriculum. So yes, I absolutely, a lot of my, I guess you would say my first intervention though is a safe eating, a safe swallowing and feeding plan. That is an intervention. That's got to be the first intervention. Once we have that established, which is the safest, most efficient, with the adequate nutrition and hydration that still fosters socialization. Once we have that set, now we can't just lay back on our laurels. We wouldn't say, "Oh, you know the alphabet now. You can read on your own." No, we build on that. Okay, now you've got your sound, your letter sound representation. Now let's blend them and segment them in, phonological awareness. Same with we've got our safe eating plan. Now, all those strategies that we have put in for safety, let's start looking at those that can actually be therapeutic. And during either those therapeutic snack times or during those science lessons when we're dealing with food, or whatever lessons you're doing, that the curriculum that are dealing with food, we can be that's where we have our direct interventions. Now, I'm not saying that speech paths shouldn't have their own goals, but I do I guess say, like, I wouldn't say that the student would increase a diet to, include 5 novel foods, because that's not our curriculum. But definitely for safety, that the
Mm-hmm.
child will be, doing some things. And that would be a whole nother podcast on
Yeah.
how to do
And
that.
I think we're like, I know because we're getting close to the
Yeah,
end, and like there's
sorry. Yeah.
so many specific things that people could look into as far as like what does the therapy session look like, and or even just diving deeper into what we've talked about today. Because I think really what I think I've taken away from this is that we want to think about what the law says that kids get access to in the schools, and
Mhm.
even just almost remove the medical complexity
Yes,
from it.
yes,
What would kids
exactly.
be a school experience be? And we give them access to that. And I think that that can be that distinction for people between again, the magic word of appropriate, where we can say, here's where we we make that distinction. And I know that it still can be fuzzy, but yes, I think thinking of it as a curriculum, and our job is to help students access the curriculum. So we offer those services to make sure that they're safe, and then also get them to the point where they're least restrictive. And I liked what you said about considering least restrictive environment is not always, it's about the experience and not always just about the place. So where
Yes,
can people go
yes.
to learn more about all of these things that
Oh,
you talked about, or just to connect with you? Because I know
yeah.
that you
Oh,
host a
I love,
podcast and all the
yes.
things.
So I also, yeah, I have a podcast too called School of Speech, but it's all about all school things, not just feeding and
Yes.
swallowing. I'm available to do trainings for schools across the nations. I love to do that. Um, I'm going to give you my email is probably
Okay.
the best to get to me, which is the letter C, the number one, and my last name Dolby. So C1 Dolby at gmail.com. But there's a lot. So the ASHA Learning Pass has an entire bundle, and disclosure, I did do the assessment part of the bundle. So I mean, I am on there, so I have to disclose that.
Hmm.
But it has a whole bundle of interventions. Well, first assessments, interventions, all in the school setting. And just this last April in the ASHA in the LS, I should know this because I also wrote in there, is the language, speech, and hearing. Oh,
Language,
Carol,
speech, and hearing services in schools, the journal.
the journal.
Yep.
Yes,
Okay.
the one
I'll
that,
I
yeah,
I can't remember the acronym. I just know the word. It's language,
yeah,
speech, and hearing services in schools. So,
that's it. It's all on feeding and swallowing in the schools. I'm
mhm,
again disclosure. I'm one of the authors, and I'm writing about cultural and linguistic responsive care, and I
mhm.
love that too. I'd love that's a whole nother podcast too because that's so
Mhm.
important as well. Because a lot of oh, no, I'm not even going to get started, or we'll be here another hour. Um, but I'd love to collaborate with people, especially if you don't know where to go, or you're getting your district is saying no, we don't have to do this. If you are out there listening and your district is saying that it's not something that we have to do, please email me. I will send you information, documentation that is black and white, the
Mhm.
law that they have to, and I would love to do that.
Mhm.
And
Great.
oh, another website is through Emily Homer. It's called Students Eat Safely. It's
Mhm.
actually just put in Emily Homer, and her website comes up. She's got a wonderful just step-by-step process on starting dysphagia, feeding and swallowing in the schools. Um, yeah, those would probably what I would suggest. Definitely.
Great. Well, we'll link
Yeah,
to all
yeah,
those. Thank you so
yeah.
much for being here with me today.
I loved it.
And yeah, we'll have to be continued.
Definitely, definitely. All right. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all of the links where you can go to learn about all of the great resources that we mentioned in this episode, as well as where you can go to learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs and other professionals working on language to create a system for language therapy. You can learn more about the program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. As always, Thank you so much for listening. It helps me so much if you leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you found this useful, please feel free to share it with your friends or colleagues. If you are interested in being a guest, if you would like to invite me to be a guest on your show, or if you have a suggestion for a guest, please send me an email at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.